Good afternoon, everyone, and I hope you've had a good lunch. I'd like to welcome you all to the post-lunch session of the 40th anniversary weekend of Rhodes Women. Of course, this is the Trailblazers session, as Ashley mentioned, and as we all know, the scholarship was only open to women after 1977. And we're privileged to have 3 women here on the panel from the 1977 batch, and 1 woman here from the 1978 batch. So it should be very exciting to see what they have to say in terms of their reflections on what it was like when they were scholars and what it's like after. I am looking forward to that conversation. And I do look forward to chatting with all of you sitting here. I'd like to introduce our first panelist, Barbara Gruey. Barbara is the Portfolio Director for International Strategy and Policy at the MITRE Corporation. And her portfolio has included being the Senior Director of the 9/11 Commission with the FBI, amongst a whole host of other careers with the government. I would also like to introduce Lisa Moschettini. Lisa is a part of Hillary Land, as everyone probably knows, one of the advisors to Hillary Clinton in 2016 and 2008. And she also owns a bookstore, Politics and Prose, in Washington, D.C., which I am excited to hear more about. Sheila Neven, who spent some time in academia and investment banking and recently retired from the Bank of Canada, where she spent her time in various leadership roles. And finally, Dr. Catherine Sweet, whose current role is senior lecturer at the Southampton Solent University School of Business, Law, and Communication, and her careers span public affairs, international relations, and corporate communications. I would also like to introduce our timekeeper, Ashley. Thank you, Ashley. And thank you all very much for being here. I think we should begin on having a short chat on the motivations behind why all of you applied to the scholarship. And in order to do that, I think we should probably start with Sheila. If you'd give us a few reflections on why you applied to the scholarship in the first place.
Well, I think one of the very first differences was that this scholarship, I didn't know anything about it being open to women until it really did open. So I was busy at university, and somebody said to me, why don't you apply? Because it's now open to women. So, you know, you weren't thinking about preparing your CV or anything before that. And to me, the opportunity, particularly coming from apartheid South Africa, to study at a place like Oxford, on a scholarship with the type of prestige and with a very illustrious alumni, was sort of overwhelming. I didn't think I'd get it when I applied. But it was really the opportunity to come to a place like Oxford and to be able to meet and be a part of this institution.
I would also like to state that the panelists can jump in at any point in time that you'd like, because we'd like for this to be a conversational session. So Lisa, would you like to tell us a little about your experience, because the American experience is perhaps very different from the South African one?
Yeah, sure. So as you all know, the scholarship became open to women in 1977. I actually graduated in 1976 from college, so it wasn't open. So I went on my merry way to a job in the Mississippi Delta working for a very small newspaper. And I hadn't thought about the Rhodes Scholarship, but I was acutely aware of the effort. And Denise, where are you, Denise? Denise referenced this morning. There were women ahead of us who had really fought hard to make sure that this scholarship would become available. And of course, Title IX had a huge role. The passage of Title IX was instrumental in the fact that Parliament finally had to recognize that this was going to happen one way or the other. So, but I hadn't really thought about it for myself, and I was in Mississippi, in this little town in the Mississippi Delta, working on this newspaper, and my senior thesis advisor in college called me and said, you know, this is open and you should apply. And I hadn't really thought about it. And then I thought, wow, that sounds, you know, kind of interesting. And so I did think about it. And in retrospect, and I think, Denise, this applies to you too a bit, I think we were very conventional candidates and somewhat unthreatening for that first year. We were both athletes. We both had fought for various causes on campus, so we had the sort of community piece of it, and we were at least decent students. So somehow we were in this very conventional mode of breaking becoming an unconventional part of this world. So I think that really was part of it, and I applied, and then obviously, am here.
I think my experience is a little bit different because I actually did a summer program at Oxford in undergraduate. So I had spent a summer at Oxford at Corpus, got the Oxford bug, and thought, this is great, but I knew at that time women weren't allowed. And as soon as women were allowed to apply, my father sent me the note saying, here you go. So having my father say, well, he was an academic, but it was something he never would have done, but he really wanted for me. And then in my, between junior and senior year, I worked at General Motors as an economist in the summer. And that fall, out came the New York Times article about the first women Rhodes Scholars, and everyone saw that article. My boss sent it to me and said, expect to see your name in next year's update. So I think the important thing was I had men in my life who were encouraging me to come do this. And I had an idea of what Oxford was like. Of course, I couldn't apply to Corpus. There are very few colleges that I could actually study at when I came as a Rhodes, but I did have a lot of influence in my life saying, go do this, go get them, give them hell.
And now for something completely different. Whoa. I was the first person in my family to go to a university. And at the end of my undergrad in America, I was skint and I was exhausted because I had worked my way all the way through 4 years. And I knew if I was going to do graduate work, I had to find somebody to pay for it. So I, in the space of 2 weeks, applied for 7 scholarships. The bottom of the pile was the Rhodes. And it was just simply one of many that I applied for. And it was 2 o'clock in the morning when I got to the bottom, and I looked at it and I said, nah, not a chance. And then I thought, hang on a minute. If everybody thinks that, then we're going to have a really small pool of women. So my motivations were money, and second was feminist solidarity. Because I thought to myself, if, you got to be in it to win it. I don't stand a chance to win it, but I'll bump up the numbers, And then all the people who said women shouldn't be part of the scholarship will be proved wrong because there are enough women who have applied who are really good. So I was just there to make up the crowd. And then lo and behold, I got here.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, all of you. I think that the difference in experience speaks to something that's quite fundamental about how all of us have experienced our time at Oxford. So, Barbara, would you like to tell us a little bit about what it was like in terms of your expectations before you got to Oxford and what life was like at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar?
Well, I had really high expectations of this really fantastic academic experience. I expected all this history. So I sort of had in my mind what it was going to be like, and it was nothing like that. First of all, ended up at St. Hilda's, which I called the convent across the bridge. And at the time, of course, there wasn't email, there wasn't cell phones, and everything was by pigeon post. And so even to set up meeting a friend for tea took 3 days of negotiations by pigeon post. And so I was very isolated. And then within the first 2 weeks I was here, I had a very bad bike accident and broke my hand and was in kind of bad shape and couldn't write for a period of time. And then my college didn't take a liking to me. And I even had the principal say, maybe you should go back to Michigan. And so it really wasn't a welcoming kind of place. They also wouldn't let me keep my trunk in my room to store my things because it might spontaneously combust. Now, I don't know about physics in the UK, but it must be different here that inert things just suddenly burst into flame, but apparently that happens. And so for me, it wasn't a good academic experience. So I made it into a different experience. So I rowed for my college. I played volleyball for the university and got my half blue. And I traveled. I was elected social secretary of the MCR and threw some good parties. But it wasn't what I expected at all. I expected to come and be intellectually vibrant and all that, and it just wasn't that. And I've come back for reunions later and gone to sessions. I remember one with Jennifer Walsh that I attended and thought, wow, this place is fantastic now. Why couldn't I be here now when there's this great Rhodes community, intellectual vibrancy? And so I sort of felt like, you know, it wasn't what I expected. So I'd like to do it over. Can I get a do-over? Charles?
Sheila, you coming from apartheid South Africa at the time, I mean, Oxford must have been quite a very different experience from your experience in college there. So could you give us a little insight into that?
Yes, certainly I think my experience was a little different from Barbara's. And context is everything here. And I think we do tend to speak in generalities that the Rhodes experience is more or less the same across. It really isn't. So I had enormously high expectations of coming here, great excitement. And in fact, it lived up to my expectations. The Americans, the North Americans in my year used to sail across on the QE2, which I thought would have been fabulous. But anyway, we just flew in on our own. There was no gathering beforehand. So you arrive on your own. You carry your suitcase from the station up to your college because there were no wheels in those days. And, but, yeah, the wheel was only invented after that. But in some ways, while I used to look at the American women being chased down the street by camera crews, photographing them in that first year, and I was pleased I wasn't there. And I used to be fairly envious of them, thinking they knew everyone, and I didn't know anyone. In fact, I think it probably enhanced my Oxford experience, because my Oxford experience really mainly centered on my college. Nearly all my friends were British, or I met them through sports or other activities. So it was, I think, a very different experience. I did a second first degree, which many of us were encouraged to at the time. And I loved it, actually, because it was an opportunity to explore ideas with interesting people. The MCR, I was used to a university where you sort of were channeled into your faculty. Whereas here in the MCR, you suddenly were open to all sorts of disciplines. And that was fantastic. So you were debating things with people on subjects you really knew nothing about, but that never really mattered. And so it was an enormously positive experience for me. I had very positive memories of Rhodes House. I thought because my life was centered really around college and various friends I had, it was a good experience with Rhodes House. And I see.
Yeah, I see, Lisa.
I just want to, because you mentioned two things that I think are worth commenting on a little bit. And I do think that the North American experience was probably very, very different. She alluded to the QE2 trip. So imagine this, we were elected, there was instant attention on us. From the moment we were elected, suddenly we were these curiosities. And I'm using the term purposely. We weren't just women who won Rhodes Scholarships, it was like, who were these women? What kind of women were they? Were they just like men, but in women's bodies? Were they some other kind of creature? Were they, who were we? What were we going to do? Were we just going to do this scholarship and then go and get married and have babies, or were we going to change the world? And all of these questions arose literally the second we were elected, and this attention was paid to us. And as Sheila said, there were enormous amount of media attention even before we got here. We were being photographed, we were being interviewed. Denise was on the cover of Women's Sports Magazine, right? There were just all of these reminders that we were in the spotlight and that we were being judged according to some weird metrics that we had no control over, actually, and that had historical bases in the trust and the world's fight, but were now layered in with all sorts of other expectations. So imagine that we arrive in New York, and then we're about to go on a 4-day transatlantic co-ed slumber party to get here, which of course raised a whole nother round of questions out in the broader world. And then we got here, and I had very similar expectations to you of the academic life and this sort of rich, incredible place and its history and so on. And, I got to college, and of course, only certain colleges admitted women, typically the women's colleges and the poorer men's colleges. In addition to having to do the 5P in your, to get heat in your room or hot water in the shower, et cetera, which was a bit of an adjustment, I did experience the realities of Oxford in a gender sense and in a historical sense very quickly when I was reading PPE, and I had an economics tutor in Wadham College who I will not name, but who, in fact, is no longer alive. But in any case, he, not because I killed him, although it kind of did cross my mind, but. I was in this little, and it wasn't really a tutorial. It was about 5 or 6 of us in this session with him. And there were several women and several undergraduates, and British undergraduates. And he drew a parabola on the board. And he said, "This is the most beautifully symmetrical mathematical figure that exists. As beautiful and symmetric as a beautifully symmetric woman's body." And my jaw clanked against the table. And the British were saying, "Beautifully symmetric." Now, there is a postscript to this story, which is that a couple years ago I was asked to speak at an alumni gathering, a Wadham alumni gathering in London. And I did not tell this story. However, Ken McDonald, who's the warden at Wadham and somebody I know quite well now, came up to me at the end and he said, "Lissa, I'd like to introduce you to," the name of the woman, an elderly woman. "Do you remember so-and-so," the Don in question? And I was about to say, "Oh, yes, of course I remember him." And he said, "Oh, this is his widow." And I went, clamped my tongue shut and said, "Oh, how lovely to meet you." Anyway, that was kind of a rude awakening coming from the United States as a product of, as a young product, but nonetheless a product of the women's movement and the civil rights movement and everything else, and Title IX, and having fought for Title IX in my college days. So, it didn't meet my expectations entirely in that realm.
I had an interesting Don story as well. I don't know if they still have them, but some of them had bed sits. So their office, you walk in and there's a desk and a chair, and then there's their bed. And I had my accident, so I was, had my arm in a sling, and I came in and I dropped into the nearest chair. And he says to me, "That's not the most comfortable place to sit." And I was like, "Oh." And he pulled out a different chair.
I don't think that story's unique to England, unfortunately, but yeah.
Yeah, Catherine?
I just want to butt in to say that not all American or North American trajectories are the same. And what we discovered in the room back there is that all of us have had very different experiences. When I arrived in Oxford, the one thing I was absolutely determined to do was not stay around Rhodes Scholars. So I disappeared. I came here for the welcome dinner, and I never again crossed the threshold. Partially because I was a bit awkward. When I came here, I was determined not to do a first degree, and my God, that was like, eating babies. And more important was, I was going to resign the scholarship if they made me go to an all-women's college. Now, that's kind of like picking up a gun and pointing it to the head of the Rhodes warden. But I said, no, been there, done that. I'm here to get a graduate education at a coeducational institution. And fortunately, St. Anthony's took me. Yay! But it was challenging back then to be able to stand on your principles and not allow the university to tell you what to do. And just because it was a Rhodes Scholarship, for me, it was access. It was getting the education I wanted. It wasn't about being a Rhodes Scholar.
Thank you. Thank you all for these hilarious reflections as well. But I think the one thing that really stands out is the question of identity. That would be helpful to hear from all of you. In terms of how is it that the Rhodes Scholarship defined you? How is it that you defined yourself in relation to the Rhodes Scholarship? And all of the expectations that came along with the tagline of fighting the world's fight, in terms of not only your time here, but even after that. I think it would be interesting for all of us to hear. Perhaps Barbara could start with her reflections on the legacy and the identity.
I think I expected, again, that the label Rhodes Scholar would do certain things for me and that it would put me in a certain position. And I think I thought that because I had seen male Rhodes Scholars have that, and that they would come out afterwards and they were part of this community and part of the Good Old Boys Network, and that it would then have a big difference. And I guess I was surprised. I don't feel that it did make a difference. And it's interesting, we were talking earlier, I know that a lot of scholars post my time, McKinsey would come and they would, recruit all these people and bring them all in as consultants. When I was here, they hadn't done that. I ended up going to McKinsey and they didn't bring me in as a consultant. They brought me in as a research level person because they didn't think that my degree at Oxford warranted being a consultant. Whereas even like a year later, male scholars started being brought in as consultants, and then it started, the whole thing where they came recruiting here. So I think the timing of it is, we had not yet established ourselves, women Rhodes Scholars, as being true Rhodes Scholars, I think. And so I just think that it just didn't have the impact that I sort of expected.
Thank you. Sheila, would you like to reflect a little bit on how you consider the Rhodes Scholarship as constituting a part of your identity, or whether you even do in the first place?
I think there's some things about the Rhodes Scholarship that are enduring as part of your identity, and one of it is the extraordinary privilege you've had, which leads you on to the second, which is enduring, which is, I think, the stress of the expectation. And this has been referred to in both sessions I've been to this morning, that there is a bit of a burden that one has, trying to live up to the expectations. And in particular, you could even tie this into the turbulent legacy, because even more, and particularly as a South African woman born in Zimbabwe, I've always felt that incredible responsibility to give back in areas that I think are most important. And for me, it's been, it certainly early on was areas related to Southern Africa. There's the network. I moved after 6 years. I went back to South Africa immediately because I wanted to participate in what change was happening. And because I knew if I didn't go back there, I had a job offer in London, that I probably wouldn't go back. So I did go back. And I'm really pleased I did, was involved in human rights and so on. But then I met a guy, and I moved to Canada. So in Canada, I really didn't have a network. In South Africa, I knew a lot more of the Rhodes Scholar Network and was quite involved in selection and so on. When I went to Canada, I didn't know people, and I didn't try and use the network or anything. I've got no doubt that in applying for jobs as a new immigrant, the Rhodes Scholarship certainly helped me. So it's always there. It's an enormous privilege to have had it. It's also a burden, and I do believe it has helped me in my life, both from the experiences I've had here and the experiences afterwards.
Thank you. I think in terms of grappling with the legacy of the scholarship and the turbulent history, of course, of injustice, I wonder how, Lisa, you dealt with this in your role as a political actor.
You know, it's an interesting question, and just to piggyback on this question of sort of what it does or doesn't do for you, I just as by way of background, I grew up at a time, came of age as Title IX was being sorted out in the United States, and of course that was a great change maker for those of you who may not be familiar with it, which I'm sure most of you are. It requires institutions that receive federal funding in the United States not to discriminate on the basis of gender and other things. And that really opened the doors for many, many ways in which women could then participate in mostly in academic institutions, in sports and other arenas, science and so on. But I was in the first class of women at Harvard that was allowed to live in Harvard Yard. I then fought for Title IX in college. I was then in the first class of women Rhodes Scholars. I then went to work eventually as the chief speechwriter for a woman who was trying to redefine the role of First Lady of the United States, the most symbolic female role in American government and politics. And then, of course, have been with her on and off as she became the first woman to be a major nominee of a major presidential party. And so I feel like my entire trajectory has been infused with this notion of always sort of being on the edge of something changing, hopefully for the better. And so I think the Rhodes experience for me and the legacy part of it are sort of tied together in that way. You couldn't be here and be in our class, the class of 1977, without being reminded every minute that it was a history-making situation and that you were being, as I said earlier, judged and measured by certain standards, external standards that you didn't have much control over. And so I think I did feel that weight going forward. At the same time, I felt privileged and proud to have been able to participate here in this. And certainly I think it's helped open doors in ways that doors might not have opened, and for better or worse or right or wrong. I mean, I think it's just a fact. In terms of the legacy itself, and I remember, Denise, you know Randy Kennedy, and some of you know Randy Kennedy from our professor at Harvard now, who's a wonderful friend of mine, African-American, came from Princeton, got a Rhodes Scholarship, and he wrote a piece for the Washingtonian magazine right after we all got over here. And he described what it was like to go through the interview process as a black man in a very heavily white situation. And I don't remember much about the piece other than him describing whether he thought things were helping or hurting him as this process evolved. But he got to the end of the piece and he said, "I still wonder, am I playing a joke on Cecil Rhodes, or is Cecil Rhodes playing a joke on me?" And I think some of us as women, we didn't articulate it that way, but I think we sort of have felt that all along. Should we feel good about this or should we feel guilty about this? But just getting back to why I don't feel really guilty about it, and why I hope none of you do. You know, how many of you have seen the play Hamilton? Okay, you know the song, "The Room Where It Happens"? You know, you gotta be in the room where it happens. And I think by being here, you're in the room where it happens, and that's why this room looks so incredibly different than it did when we came over. You know, by working in whatever walk of life you're in. It's why you applied at first, Catherine, is to be in the room, at least have some women in the room where it happens, right? And so you just have to be there. You have to be there and be doing it for anything to happen. And so that's what we're all doing in one way or another.
Thank you, Lisa, for that. Catherine, I think you had a few reflections when we were chatting earlier about this.
I almost feel like saying, and now for something completely different. One of the challenges is that if you are in an environment where you're the first of anything, everybody wants to put these things in labels. But for me, it was a different experience in that I almost felt like somebody had put a label on my back that said, "Kick me." And the reason is because I had no ambiguity. I was actually deeply embarrassed about getting the Rhodes Scholarship. And the reason is because I was quite an active anti-apartheid activist. And I found it very hard to reconcile the fact that I was, you know, coming to Oxford on money that was basically, well, I won't go there. Anyway, it was very, very hard for me politically. And the one thing I didn't want to do was wear the label as a badge of honor. You can, because the scholarship has changed. Back in '77, it didn't feel that way for anybody who was, and wow, this is difficult for an American to say this, I was a socialist. Yeah? Woo, yeah. And it was, you know, I wasn't like the rest of the American Rhodes Scholars. And when I got here, I just disappeared. I took the money and ran. And thereafter, what I did is I found that being labeled an American Rhodes Scholar was actually a problem. But I got over it, and I found my own way, and I stayed. That was the other thing. I didn't go back to America. There was a piece of me when I came across the threshold, and I went, free at last. I didn't have to go back and conform to other people's expectations of what I was supposed to do and what my interpretation of fighting the good fight was. There was a piece of me that went, I don't think I agree with an awful lot of what people think is fighting the good fight. So I'm just going to keep quiet. So part of my career has been actually playing down the label and not worrying about it. I've been here now for 40 years in the United Kingdom, and I would argue for at least 30 of those years, I have not used the label. Most people don't know, because it wasn't currency. In my fields and in my work, it didn't help me in any way, shape, or form. Having an Oxford doctorate did. That made a difference. So what I would argue with you guys is find your own way. Don't let other people define you. Choose your own path.
On that note, I think we'll open it up for the audience also to ask questions. So if there's anyone who wants to pose a question to the panel, then the floor is open, so please. Okay, as the moderator, I think I will abuse this privilege and ask the first question. So in terms of trying to understand the different options that you had after your time at Oxford, we're often told that we can do anything that we want. And for some of us, that's really difficult to actually decide where to apply ourselves. So, and for some of us, it is liberating to know that there are so many things out there. So for someone who's just enrolled to continue on my DPhil in law, it would be interesting to see how all of you grappled with these choices at the end of your 2 years at Oxford. So, Lisa, would you like to start?
Sure. So I I think the last time I was at Oxford, I was actually on a panel that was about people who switch careers frequently. And I was sort of exhibit A of somebody who had no particular plan then and clearly did not have at least a straight line plan since. So as I mentioned, I had worked for this little newspaper in Mississippi, and I was thinking about being a journalist, but I wasn't really sure. I hadn't even lined up that job once I graduated from college. I got it the summer after. Then I came here. And then I sort of decided I was going to be a journalist, but I had still sort of been thinking about law school. Anyway, I became a journalist, and then after that, I decided, after about 15 years of doing that, I went into government and politics. And as you mentioned now, my husband, who's here, and I own a bookstore in Washington. And I never really felt pressure to conform and take a straight line, but I didn't really appreciate the importance of allowing yourself to do what I did, or understand sort of in an articulate way how to describe that until I read a great book. I hope some of you have read it, called Composing a Life by Mary Catherine Bateson. Has anybody read it? Yeah, and she's Margaret Mead's daughter. She's a wonderful anthropologist, and it's really a study of women around the world. But her point is this. Her point is that women need to be free, and this really is something to think hard about, especially the younger women here. You need to be free to compose your life based on the ingredients of your life at that moment, your needs at that moment, your constraints at that moment, and figure out what composition works for you. And at some point that may be you're going full steam ahead in your career. At other points it may be you have to get off the track for a bit to do whatever, raise a family, do something else, take care of a parent, and that's okay. And so basically what she's saying is, look, you can go from A to Z in a straight line and get there really fast and have all the accolades, but taking the windy road through the mountains might have the better views even if it takes you longer. And so I wouldn't change my life. I wouldn't change any of the 3 careers I've had at all. But I certainly didn't plan it. And, you know, it's worked out pretty well.
Yeah, Barbara.
You know, I had similar experiences where, as I like to say, it's always good to have a plan B. I think I'm on plan Z. Because you know, you make choices and you say, hey, I'm going to go do this. You know, my whole plan was to go to law school, which I did, and do law and economics, which I did for all of 3 years. And then I had a chance to go be a federal prosecutor because I wanted to be in court. And I also wanted to grow up to be Nancy Drew, and that was sort of it. I could go be an investigator, which led to doing special assignments, which led to being on the 9/11 Commission, which led to doing an assignment in San Diego and learning to race sailboats. And I was racing sailboats when someone said, hey, we need someone with your background. Why don't you come to MITRE? You know, and so it was, I think the most important thing is when opportunity knocks, open the door. I mean, it's just simple as that. And having, you know, looking backwards, I can see the path, but I never would have seen that path moving forward. And even where I've been at the same company now for 11 years and have done 4 or 5 paths there. And so I think it is exactly as you say, Lissa. You've got to say, hey, is this something I want to do now? Does this make sense for me? And be open to throwing out the original plan when something better comes along.
Sheila, I think you've also had a number of careers, so you could perhaps weigh in.
Right. I just want to start off by saying that Lissa and Barbara have captured the elements perfectly. I still feel like when I grow up, I'm going to decide what I want to do. And I retired from the central bank. But there's another thought too. I think that being open to opportunity, making opportunity, taking opportunity is so important. Because I'm 40 years older than, at least 40 years older than the current scholars. In 20 years' time or 30 years' time, the jobs that you're going to be doing don't exist now. So you can't plan exactly where you're going to be, but you need to be open and follow that, you know, whether it's passion or so on. And also, as Lissa said, a career path to me was certainly not a straight line. I started in academics because I thought that would give me a lot of flexibility, and I loved working with students and I liked teaching, but then I decided I wasn't a researcher. So I thought, well, I'd better find out what the private sector's like, so I worked in an investment bank. And that confirmed for me that I actually wanted to work in public service type roles. So when I went to Canada, I thought central banks were kind of interesting, and I wandered my way around it. And so it has been enormously fulfilling, but as I say, it's not a straight line. You have interruptions. You might have family crises, you might have children you want to spend more time with, or anything. And a career path is a combination of all these things, and the personal, the private motivation, what you're trying to achieve.
Catherine.
What they said. The challenge, I'm probably worse than all of you. I mean, I've had 22 job titles, and I've worked for probably 30 organizations over my life. So, yeah, most people would go, she can't hold a job. No, I just have a really low threshold of boredom. So I like doing a lot of different things. Or rather, actually, and this is what I want to build on in terms of your stuff, it's about you. It's about what you're good at. Where you do what you're good at may change dramatically over your career. Be open to every opportunity to do what you're really good at. Now, it may be hard at your age to know what you're really good at, but I kind of describe it because I'm now a lecturer. Okay, the last decade has been all about teaching young students like the scholars that we have here, the young scholars. And what I say to them is, if somebody picked up a gun and pointed at your head and said, "What are you?" I know what would come out of my mouth. I would say, "I'm a communicator and I solve problems. Can I help you solve this one?" I write and I communicate. And every single one of my really weird paths has taken me everywhere around the world and in all kinds of different jobs. I've worked in politics, I've worked in corporate, I've worked in non-governmental, I've worked, you name it, I've been there. got the T-shirt. All of them are about communication, bridging gaps and solving problems with communication. Now, I'm about to start in 2 weeks' time my last career, I hope, because I'm retiring from academia and becoming a fiction writer. Now, most people would sit there and go, why? Because you reach the places with fiction that nonfiction can't reach. And I've suddenly realized, because I now work in an online community around the world, publishing fiction, that I can reach people in China and change lives through the power of a story. So find what you're good at, and then go take wherever the path goes, go for it. As long as you keep to that passion of your own, you'll be successful in your own definition. Even if you don't win a lot of prizes or have a great job title, you'll still be successful.
Thank you. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
So, you know, we talked about how difficult it was for women when we first started out, and we saw progress. Yet I think all of us have continued to experience that it's not perfect. And I mean, I've had supervisors say my job performance rating would be higher if I was a man, because men can be aggressive in the courtroom and women need to be little bluebirds of happiness. I hope I don't seem to be like a bluebird of happiness, but so I'm wondering.
Very blue.
Yeah, it was very blue. But I'm wondering, has it been sort of a continual up for women, or have there been fallbacks? And how are you sort of seeing, are we going backwards, or are we continuing forward? How is it?
Well, I think if you look at this room, obviously we're moving forward in really, really important, critical, essential ways. And, you know, the more women Rhodes Scholars there are, the more women picking Rhodes Scholars there are, the more women going into the professions and careers that all of you are choosing or not choosing, you know, is going to make a difference. Slowly but surely, you begin to change culture, you begin to change attitudes, you begin to change norms. I think, however, as that happens, as we all know, and we don't, you know, those of us who have suffered through the American election know, women's progress also creates backlashes. And, you know, the backlash we're experiencing right now is not only mind-boggling and distressing, it's really dangerous, frankly, not only for the United States, but for the entire world. And it clearly represents a contempt for women's progress and a willingness to lash out in various ways that we've now seen since the election of Donald Trump. So, you know, I think progress can come steadily and incrementally, but you always have these moments of backlash like we're seeing in so many realms right now. So I find that, you know, an unfortunate thing. But I think what it means is you also get the reaction like the Women's March that took place around the world. And one of the greatest almost, you know, and of course, let me just point out, the march was going to be a big failure because these women were so disorganized, right? And they didn't have a permit, and then they had the wrong permit. And then, you know, it was going to be the day after inauguration in Washington in January when it's snowy and there'd be no place, and how would they get in, and yada, yada, yada. Okay, how many millions and millions and millions of women turned out, not just in Washington, but around the world? That kind of expression of solidarity and, you know, sisterhood, and by the way, also supported by many, many men, including my husband who's here, you know, that has to continue. And so as the backlash happens, there has to be the counter backlash to the backlash.
Yep, Sheila.
Just to add a little bit to what you've said, Lissa, I think an interesting thought experiment, I was thinking about this before I came here. When we were sitting here in 1977 or 1978, if someone had said to us, in 40 years' time, in 2017, what would you expect the role of women, the women's place in the world to have been? I'm not sure I could answer it, but exactly. But I think I thought there would have been more progression. And it might be interesting for you guys, current scholars, to do some of that thinking. You know, when you're thinking ahead to, heavens, 2057, what do you expect the world to look like? And this is not just in the place of women, but it's in racism, it's in all these areas where we've seen this very uneasy, very difficult backlash. So that was interesting for me anyway.
So first of all, are there any questions from the audience as well? Yeah, Numfundo.
Hello, my name is Mfundo. I'm from South Africa. So somebody mentioned sisterhood and solidarity, and I tweeted about it earlier, I think yesterday. And I think one of the barriers for me being in Rhodes House and sort of thinking about sisterhood and solidarity has been sort of navigating the differences in class and race and nationality and religion, and how that's really a really huge barrier to solidarity and sisterhood in Rhodes House, and the fact that there are cliques around, national lines, around racial lines, also like around class lines, like who gets to go traveling with whom and when. And I just sort of, and it's one of the things that we don't talk about, like, we want to talk about sisterhood and solidarity, but we never talk about this, and just wanted to sort of put that on, the table to sort of engage with you guys and your experience of these differences and how you were navigating it during that time, and, what lessons you might have for us in actually creating a sisterhood and a solidarity, because currently, I'm not lying and saying like there's very little solidarity and sisterhood that's across class, race, and nationality lines. In my year, let me not speak for other classes, I'll speak for our class, yeah.
Do you feel solidarity, though, among women as women, apart from the other?
That's solidarity I'm saying doesn't exist within Rhodes House. I'm specifically speaking about sisterhood. It doesn't.
Well, can I come back on that? Because one of the things I do is I teach intercultural communication. And because I've traveled all around the world and I've dealt with lots of different races, lots of different people, lots of different situations, lots of different class issues, I'm not of the wealthy aristocratic British class. And that really caused some problems in my career. And it has proved to be quite interesting to deal with situations where I was a consultant in the Middle East and women are not professionals. And there have been times when you get hit with these problems, I'm not saying that they're going to go away. They're going to still be there. And so one of the challenges you face is to recognize that there are all kinds of fault lines, and that Americans who like to, hang together and play American football, I wasn't part of that. So you don't have to be part of it. You can define yourself. But in so doing, you may run some risks of cutting yourself off, okay? So you have to play a balancing game. And you have to know when it's right to be part of a group and not part of a group. But you will always be able to define yourself. If you let other people define you, you become a victim. So I've worked in places where women don't work. I've been involved in things where an American would be highly suspicious, and yet you can get away with it.
Thank you, Catherine. I think Lisa had a point.
Yeah,
Lisa
just to take a stab at that, because it's a really important question, and obviously we've seen it play out in American politics. We've seen it throughout the women's movement, which was essentially a white women's movement, clearly, and which is now very belatedly being recognized, that is a problem, and that women are not monolithic. Most categories of people are not people who feel the same way about everything. And we make a mistake to try to assume that all women feel the same way. We know from this election that they don't. And so how do we bridge those natural divides that exist and yet still feel our solidarity as women and feel a kind of sisterhood that you're describing? And I think we're still working out how to do that. And it's part of it is because of a very belated recognition and understanding and acknowledgement that women are not monolithic, that it isn't just a white woman's issue or a white woman's problem or a white woman's solution. And I do, though, and maybe I'm more optimistic than you, Catherine, I do feel that there are unique things that unite women around the world, that unite women across class, gender, class, ethnicity, religion, and so on. And I think that remains constant, but I think we also have to recognize that there are other areas where our lives are very dissimilar, our challenges are different, our ability to have opportunity and access to things is different.
If I could just add, I think your point is exactly right, that it's not monolithic and there are all those differences, which means you can't sit back and expect it to happen automatically. It takes work, it takes leadership, it takes involvement and working across those things, because if you come in and say, well, it's not here, I can't find it, well, what have you done to try to make it here for others and have that leadership? And so it takes leadership and action for those things to happen. It will not happen organically.
So,
Can I just say one other quick thing?
Absolutely.
Just because you're raising such an important point. And I think as frustrating as it feels to you, and I don't doubt that it is, and you're absolutely right, but that frustration is actually weirdly a point of progress. Here's some context for that. When I first went to work for the Clinton administration, I was a speechwriter, and I got to work on Hillary Clinton's big speech in Beijing in 1995 at the United Nations World Conference on Women. You're all too young to ever probably even know about it. But it became fairly famous and enduring because of one line in the speech, which was, well, because hopefully more than that, but what was enduring was this line that was, human rights are women's rights, and women's rights are human rights. Now, that sounds incredibly obvious, right? Of course, duh, right? At the time, there were so many questions about, well, wait a minute, wait, women's rights are human rights? Like, people were confused that women's rights could actually be called human rights, because just women's stuff in general was viewed as this one thing. Now we've gotten beyond that to the point where we can see that there are distinctions and there have to be different ways to address different challenges and different conditions for different kinds of women around the world. So I think it's weirdly a point of progress, even though there's a lot of work still to be done.
Thank you so much. I think piggybacking on Mfundo's question, of course it takes leadership and action to actually galvanize a solidarity and a sisterhood. But I think that the point that I think she's making, or at least that I'm going to make, is that coming from different communities, the cost of that effort that you make and the burden that you bear is quite different. And so I think my question would be speaking to how we can recognize and understand those costs, and how we can perhaps lift those costs instead of feeling those costs. So I think perhaps it's a variation on a similar question, but would perhaps ask you to reflect on your experience here. When you were here, what sorts of experiences did you have in terms of crossing these fault lines and in terms of actually trying to galvanize a sort of sisterhood or a sort of movement which was broader than just one particular class or one particular group?
You know, it's interesting because I don't think I certainly didn't think of it that way back then. But there's one little anecdote I have that sort of sums up what it was like back then. When I was at St. Hilda's, the JCR held a vote. And the vote was whether women could have the option, not be required, but have the option to be called Ms. instead of Miss. It failed. And we were not allowed to use the term Ms. I mean, it just sort of, it was just a weird time, and you just sort of, well, and I had come from Wellesley, you know, progressive women's college, which was the college of 2 women secretaries of state and the first woman candidate for president. And so a very advanced kind of place. And I felt that I had gone back 2 centuries. And so I wasn't thinking of trying to move forward. I was thinking of trying to just not lose ground.
Thank you. Sheila?
I was going to say Oxford was not nearly, I mean, it's so heartening to look out across this room, because in our year, Oxford wasn't diverse. In fact, the first South African Rhodes Scholar who wasn't white was also elected in 1977 from the same place I come from. And so that just gives you an indication. I think the costs are enormously different, and it's on us, particularly for whom the costs are less to actually work much harder to understand where the tensions are and where the costs can be reduced, in my view.
Catherine, would you like to add to that?
The challenge for me is to sit here and say, I'm not sure that the solution is within Oxford or the university. And that, to be honest, to deal with the kind of issues about class, about gender, about race, about identity, one of the things I would recommend to everyone here is, in a way, what I did, which is get out of the bubble. Go find real people. Okay. I mean, looking out at Oxford generally, and looking across, from a JCR or an MCR or even an SCR, you see an awful lot of the same kind of people. And what I tried to do was to get out into the real world and learn more about what was happening in Oxford outside of the university. So get involved in local community activities, go volunteer for, a substance abuse team that's working down in Cowley, whatever. Find out what's going on in the real world here. And you might find that those kind of barriers that seem to be very impermeable here can actually be broken down if you're willing to get outside of the bubble.
Thank you. Lisa, did you want to add to that?
I mean, I think I've sort of said what I would say. I mean, I just agree with Barbara. It's hard to compare now to then. It was a different universe. I mean, we were just beginning to see little cracks in some of these doors for any women. And so we were preoccupied with that. And as I said, there was so much attention. It was like being under a microscope at all times, which is a hindrance. And a constraint. And I think it's great that 40 years later, this discussion is happening. That you're asking that question, which wouldn't have existed then because of the people who were here then, including us.
Absolutely. I think we have time for one more question from the audience, if there's anyone. Yeah. Someone at the back.
On its way. It's kind of just a variation of the sisterhood theme. I wonder if any of you keep in touch with the other women in your class. Have they remained friends throughout your life, or have you been close, or maybe not so much?
Yeah, absolutely.
Apart from reunions, that I've been involved in the Canadian Association of Rhodes Scholars, so I would see a few people from my class, but on a regular basis, I really only see one other woman from my class. But I still keep in touch with a lot of friends I made here who weren't necessarily Rhodes Scholars.
Barbara?
Well, I think our experience is very different than more recent scholars. And I've seen this with students back in the States. We didn't have Facebook and social media and cell phones and email and all those kinds of things. And so you sort of lose touch. Where I find that kids going to school now tend to keep up relationships and friendships in different ways post-college because they have so many other ways to do it, where we just didn't. So I don't have from my class. I mean, I see some that are in Washington, and we'll have, actually it's a male from my class who organizes some dinners where we get together, but we don't have that same sort of sisterhood where when I was a prosecutor, going back to the golfing and football kinds of things, we formed a girls' poker club. And that has been enduring because it was something that we're all together and around, and we've been together for 25 years, even though we've gone on to other kinds of jobs. So I think that after we got out of Oxford, we just scattered, and there really wasn't the way to keep coming back and to keep in contact the same way, which is too bad. I think I think I would have loved to have had those kind of relationships.
Well, I'm not here because I actually want to talk to people who were here in my year, or even probably the decade after. I came because I want to talk with and communicate with and share with the current scholars and the ones who've probably been through in the last 10 years. Because the Oxford you have enjoyed is the one I wish I could have. And what I'd like to be able to do is feel like what we can do for you is offer you a sense of perspective. Maybe some advice, maybe that hotline that somebody was talking about in the in the morning sessions. If you get stuck, if you get worried, if you're anxious, all those sorts of things, sometimes just having somebody who isn't from your cohort can make a huge difference. I mean, I do quite a lot of mentoring of my graduates over the last decade. I still stay in touch, thank God for social media. LinkedIn, Facebook. I always used to say to them, when you graduate, there is an after-sales guarantee. I'm still here for you. Yeah. And that's the kind of relationship that I think I would like to see happen with the scholars community of women, because we've got a lot to share. And we can cross those boundaries, and we can be that person who isn't part of the problem, but can be part of your solution on a personal basis. So we're here for you. Take advantage of it.
Thank you, Catherine. And on that note, I think we have about 5 minutes of the session left. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to give us the one takeaway that they want us to have from this session, or the one piece of advice that they want us all to go home with. So Sheila, would you like to begin?
Okay, on the hot seat. Well, what I can say to the current Rhodes Scholars, you have an amazing privilege of being in a special place amongst a special group. And that creates a lot of expectations. So number one, I'm afraid there's more than one here. Number one, going out and thinking about what you're going to do in your life path. You don't have to do it all now. You've got at least twice the amount of time that you've already had on this earth to run your career, maybe 3 times in the normal course of things. So you don't have to do it all now. Secondly, you don't have to do it all, because I think one of the things that you get the most satisfaction from is watching those that you've mentored or helped succeed, achieve things. And so you don't have to do it all. You can facilitate it and watch other people blossom. And so with that, I think my third one is, and this has come up this morning, be kind to yourself. Humility goes a long way, or as my Canadian friend would say, get over yourself. And, you know, get on, make it your life, and your life will be a special life.
Thank you, Sheila. Lisa.
You know, I think I started off originally talking about this first group of women, the 1977 class, and how everyone was looking at us as these exotic kind of zoo animals and with huge amount of curiosity. And I think what everybody wanted to do was be able to compartmentalize and label us and make us very convenient. So we'd all fit neatly into a little box of, okay, these are women who do X, Y, or Z. As it turned out, all of the women in our class were extremely different. And ended up doing very different things, had very different interests, personalities, ambitions, and so on. And as you would imagine, over 40 years, different life stories. And so what I would say is you have to write your own story. And your story is only your story. And you have to stick to your own narrative. And that's going to be very, very important, to not let other people try to put you in some box that you don't want to be in. You know, your story you own. And you control to a certain degree, or you adapt to a certain degree. So that's the first thing. The one thing that I would say and sort of challenge you on, and this gets back to the whole what does it mean to be a Rhodes Scholar, whether you use it or not, or you advertise it or not, I think most of us are quite shy about it because we hope we're a little bit modest, but it certainly is there on your resume when you send it out. The one thing that it really does that I think it's important to remember, no one is ever going to think you're stupid. No one's ever going to think you're not an achiever. No one's ever going to think you're incompetent, thanks to being a Rhodes Scholar. Whether that is true or not, is no guarantee, but the emblem will convey to people a certain set of characteristics that people will ascribe to you, whether true or not. The question is, what does that mean for you? What that means, in my view, is that you are freer than everyone else practically in the world to take risks. You can take risks. You can think outside of the box. You can innovate. You can try different careers. You can challenge the status quo. You can speak truth to power in ways that other people can't because they don't have the luxury of the label. So you really need to take advantage of that and challenge yourself to push the limits and push the envelope because you are Rhodes Scholars. Not just because it says you're supposed to fight the world's fight, but because guess what? You have this incredible liberty and luxury, thanks to that label, to do the unconventional, to do what people don't expect of you. And so I hope all of you will go off into the world and take some really, really big chances to try to make this place a better place for everyone else, too.
Thank you very much for that, Lisa. Barbara?
So I think I've already sprinkled, my little bits of advice for what they're worth. But I think there's one thing so the last thoughts kind of thing is, this really is an amazing community now. And as we've talked about, communities are made up of different kinds of people. Everyone's not the same. Everyone doesn't have the same viewpoint and all those kinds of things. But a community can have each other's back even if you don't agree on everything. And so invest in this community, continue to make it an even stronger community, and so that everyone knows when they take the risk that your others have each other's back. Because there's going to become points in time in your life when you're going to need someone to have your back. And it's really nice to know who those people are and who you can rely on. So make the investment because you'll just reap tons of rewards.
Hashtag what they said.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank all of the panelists as well as the audience members for their engaging questions and insights. And of course, I'd like to hand over to Ashley now.
Great.